Though history records that the war for Armageddon began in 941 M41, its true origins stretched back nearly a decade earlier to the war-scorched surface of Urk in 932 M41. At that time, Ghazghkull Thraka was little more than a nameless orc boy, just another brutal warrior among countless greenskin hordes. But fate, or something far darker, intervened. During a skirmish with a force of space marines from an unknown chapter, a bolter shell struck Ghazghkull's skull, tearing through bone and flesh, blasting away a portion of his cranium and leaving him for dead. It was then that the infamous pain boy Mad Doc Grotznick found him. With crude but effective surgical skill, Grotznick replaced the shattered section of Ghazghkull's skull with a bionic implant, a device of mysterious function. Whether by some strange quirk of the implant tapping into his latent psychic powers, or through sheer madness, Ghazghkull awoke, changed. He spoke of visions, of whispers from the twin orc gods Gork and Mork. Whether this newfound power was real or a symptom of brain damage, none would dare challenge his claim. Within 6 Terran years, he had clawed his way to the top, crushing any who would oppose him. By 938 M41, he was war boss of his tribe. A year later, the opportunity for his grand conquest arrived. Urk's sun was dying, its violent solar flares bathing the planet in deadly radiation, killing thousands of orcs. But then salvation came in the form of a monstrous space hulk, drifting into orbit around the doomed world. Whether this was mere coincidence or some dark fate guiding his path, Ghazghkull saw it as a sign. With brutal determination, he rallied the 4 other orc tribes of Urk beneath his banner. He did not ask for their loyalty. He took it, uniting them through bloodshed and brute strength. Together, they boarded the Space Hulk and prepared for their greatest WAAAGH yet. Their journey through the warp was anything but smooth. The ancient Hulk's power systems failed repeatedly, causing the Geller field to flicker and collapse. As the barrier between real space and the immaterium weakened, demons poured into the vessel, forcing the orcs into battle against creatures they barely understood. But they fought without fear, reveling in the carnage, earning a level of battle hardiness that would serve them well in the brutal campaign to come. Then, 1 solar month before their arrival at Armageddon, the Space Hulk, designated Alveus Alpha Alpha Sectus by the Administratum, descended upon the system like a harbinger of doom. Its sheer mass annihilated the planet's aging orbital defenses with ease, smashing through satellites and obliterating the Imperial attack craft that dared to stand against it. Desperate messages echoed through the warp as the defenders of Armageddon called for aid. Their pleas were heard, and 3 Space Marine chapters scrambled to prepare for war. But it was already too late. The storm was coming, and nothing could halt it. On the sacred day of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, 941 M41, Ghazghkull's horde erupted from the void as their space hulks slammed into the surface of Armageddon. The orcs disembarked in an avalanche of green-skinned fury, their WAAAGH beginning in fire and blood. The second war for Armageddon had begun. The moment the orcs landed, the sky itself seemed to turn against Armageddon. A massive warp storm erupted around the system, sealing it off from the wider Imperium. No reinforcements would come. The beleaguered defenders were on their own. As Ghazghkull's horde spilled across the surface, it fractured into 5 brutal tribes. 2 of them surged northward, claiming the western half of the planet's primary subcontinent, Armageddon Prime. Yet, even as war consumed the land, the planet's ruler, Overlord Hermann von Straub, remained blind to the scale of the threat. Warnings had come, whispered in the shuffle of the Emperor's tarot, muttered by Chartist captains who had seen unnatural disturbances in the warp for months. But von Straub dismissed them all. Only when the orcs were already tearing through his world did any true distress signal escape Armageddon, and even then it was not by von Straub's hand. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, an officer of the Officio Perfectus attached to the Astra Militarum regiments of the Armageddon Steel Legion, defied von Straub's inaction and sent out the call for aid. For his defiance, von Straub banished Yarrick to Hades' Hive, an industrial stronghold on the subcontinent of Armageddon Secundus. As for the war itself, the Overlord convinced himself that the orcs could be held back with the planetary defense forces alone. Across Armageddon Prime, the Hive cities braced for the storm. The people formed militias, raised barricades, and entrenched themselves behind defensive lines. But nothing could halt the green-skinned tide. With each battle, the orcs smashed through, pushing the defenders further and further back. Von Straub, unwilling to concede the need for strategy, threw his soldiers into the fight disjointed and in desperate attacks that only led to more needless slaughter. From his exile in Hades' Hive, Yarrick refused to stand idle. He orchestrated daring shuttle runs to ferry weapons and supplies to the north, where the civilians fought there for survival. Imperial pilots skipped in and out of the atmosphere, trying to avoid the orcs' crude but deadly anti-air fire. Many never returned. Their burning wreckage fell like meteors onto the war-torn world. Then, when it became clear that nothing could stem this tide, von Straub abandoned the north entirely. He fled south, establishing his command in Hive Tartarus, deep within Armageddon Secundus, He knew the northern cities were doomed, but he still clung to the belief that victory could be his. Yet, even as he plotted his counterstrike, another threat loomed. 3 of the orc tribes had vanished, their movements unaccounted for. Princeps Prime Curtis Mannheim of the Legio Metallica Titan Legion, temporarily stationed on Armageddon, urged von Straub to prepare for an attack. He warned that the missing warbands were not in reserve, but were on the move, seeking a path to strike. But von Straub scoffed. He had convinced himself that the orcs would never be able to cross the equatorial jungles that divided Armageddon Prime from Secundus. He dismissed the danger, his mind consumed instead by visions of his own glorious counterattack. But unbeknownst to him, the storm was far from over. 2 days later, just as Princeps Prime Mannheim had foreseen, the orcs struck, and the horde surged into Armageddon Secundus. It was the season of storms, and the planet itself seemed to rage against the conflict. Volcanoes erupted in fury, choking the sky with black clouds. Beneath the storm-darkened heavens, the orcs came in an unstoppable tide. Massive armored columns smashed through the fragile Imperial lines. 2 tribes veered east of the Palatus Mountains, marching upon Hive Hades, while another barreled west toward Hive Hellsreach. Desperation drove von Straub to order the Titans of Legio Metallica into battle. Under Mannheim's command, they were the Imperium's greatest war machines, each the size of a city, striding behemoths of destruction. But Mannheim, a seasoned warrior, counseled caution. He urged von Straub to hold back, to fight a war of attrition. But the governor would hear none of it. His voice rose to a furious scream. He needed no help, he claimed, no patience, no strategy. He needed only victory. Mannheim, bound by duty, had no choice but to obey. He bid farewell to his family and led his Titans into the Inferno. The battle was cataclysmic. The Titans waded into the orc ranks, their weapons spitting death, trampling thousands of greenskins underfoot. But at the heart of the WAAAGH stood the orcs' own monstrous war machines, the Gargants, crude but terrifying imitations of the Emperor's god machines. They met the Titans in brutal duels of fire and steel, and one by one, the mighty war engines of the Imperium fell. Mannheim saw the tide turning. His legion was being torn apart, yet he could not retreat. Instead, he led the remnants of Legio Metallica and their Skitarii escorts straight into the orc horde. 6 million greenskin warriors closed in, their Gargants towering above them. In the chaos of battle, Mannheim's Titan, Steel Hammer, engaged a Gargant in a vicious grinding duel and slew the beast. But the orcs were endless. Wounded, surrounded, his war machine failing, Mannheim made his final decision. With grim resolve, he triggered Steelhammer's self-destruct sequence. The explosion consumed him, obliterated 2 more Gargants, and carved the heart out of the Orc offensive. The battlefield burned, and for the first time, the Orcs staggered. His sacrifice had cost them dearly, and for his heroism, Mannheim would be posthumously awarded the Emperor's Star. But the Imperium was far from saved. With the Titans gone, the Imperials had lost their strongest shield. The defenders of Armageddon Secundus retreated, rallying along the rivers, the Styges in the west, a Diabolist in the east. They dug in, hoping to hold. But when the storms lifted, the Orcs came again, sweeping south in an unstoppable wave. Hive and Furnace fell without a fight, its commanding officer gripped by fear and despair, surrendered without firing a single shot. What followed was a nightmare. Refugee columns stretched for hundreds of kilometers across the burning desert, but they did not escape. The Orcs' speed freak warbands descended upon them like predators, circling, striking, cutting down those who ran. They corralled the terrified masses and drove them back into the clutches of the Greenskins. Hive and Furnace became a vast factory of suffering, its people enslaved to fuel the Orc war machine. The Imperium had suffered a crushing defeat. The war for Armageddon was far from over, but for those who had fallen into the hands of the Orcs, it had already been lost. The siege of Hades' Hive had begun. The Orcs gathered in the thousands, their monstrous war machines looming in the distance. Their crude but devastating artillery pounding the Hive's defenses. Within the city's steel walls, the people of Hades fought for survival, their spirit bound to a single figure, Commissar Sebastian Yarick. Yarick was everywhere. One moment, he was at the great blast portals, helping weld them shut before the Orcs could breach them. The next, he was deep in the Underhive, negotiating uneasy alliances with the city's gangs. Against all odds, he forged an army from desperate men and women, Hive gangers, remnants of the Steel Legion, and civilians with nothing left to lose. They had no supply lines, little power, and their rations dwindled to rats and roaches. But Yarick would not let them break. In the darkness of his private bunker, Overlord von Straub brooded. His world was slipping from his grasp, and in his desperation, he turned to a secret weapon long hidden by his family. Ancient virus bombs, remnants from a time before memory, when Armageddon first stood against annihilation. These missiles, mounted on rusting launchers, were a last resort. But time had eroded their terrible power. Many failed to launch. Others detonated improperly. And the dreaded Life Eater virus had withered with age. Though the orcs suffered losses, it was nowhere near enough to halt the invasion. Von Straub, humiliated, withdrew deeper into his fortress, leaving the fate of his world to others. To the west, in Hive Hell's Reach, another battle raged. Inspired by Yarick's defiance, the city's defenders fought with unmatched ferocity. Street gangs turned their homes into death traps, ambushing orcs at every corner. Improvised explosives turned alleyways into slaughterhouses. The towering oil supertanks, once the lifeblood of Hell's Reach's industry, were repurposed as makeshift transports, ferrying civilians to waiting ships in the dockyards of Grindel's Lock. But the ships were not enough. The people cast lots for their survival, and those left behind knew their fate was sealed. With no hope of escape, they chose to die on their own terms. Suicide bombers strapped explosives to their chests and hurled themselves into the orc ranks, detonating among the greenskins in fiery defiance. And then there were the dock workers. They welded themselves into the massive cargo cranes, turning them into improvised war machines, swinging their enormous arms to smash into the towering orc gargants. For a moment, it seemed as if the orcs might falter, that the cost of taking Hell's Reach would be too great even for them. But then, the Weird Boys came. Gathering their unnatural power, the orc psychers unleashed a devastating psychic assault. A wave of raw, malevolent energy swept through the city, shattering the minds of every remaining human defender. And like that, the battle was over. Hell's Reach belonged to the orcs. But Hades' hive still stood. Ghazghkull himself arrived at the front, his massive frame bristling with crude yet devastating weaponry. The warlord of the orcs surveyed the unbroken city and knew that he had found a worthy challenge. He tried everything. Elite commandos rappelling down from the hive's spires, massive siege weapons designed to shatter its walls, even gargants retrofitted with massive earth-moving devices meant to tear through the city's defenses. Each attempt was met with failure. For every cunning trick Ghazghkull devised, Yarick had an answer. Rappelling commandos slipped into the hive's ventilation shafts, only to be met by maintenance crews armed with nothing but bolt pistols and knives. Not a single greenskin emerged alive. When the orcs feinted to draw the defenders away, Yarick used the hive's transport network to counter every move. Suicide bombers crept beyond the walls, slipping into enemy encampments and reducing their siege weapons to twisted wreckage. Hades would not fall, not while WAAAGH still drew breath. As the siege of Hades' hive raged on, the war spread. From the fallen ruins of Hell's Reach and the enslaved depths of Infernus, orc warbands surged south, their sights set on Hive Acheron. To the embattled defenders of the last bastion of human resistance, it felt as though the storm of war was about to consume them whole. From their watchtowers and flickering ocular monitors, the Archarians could see the endless green tide advancing towards them. Their governor rallied them with fiery words, vowing that they would never surrender. But morale alone would not stop the horde. The only reinforcements they had received from Overlord Van Straub were his hollow reassurances and 20 members of his personal guard, the ones he disliked the most. Then, just as the orcs prepared to breach the outer hive, the sky split apart. Explosions ripped through the orc ranks, tearing their ramshackle war machines into flaming wreckage. The greenskin advance halted in utter confusion as the defenders of Acheron looked on in disbelief. From the heavens, Imperial aircraft roared into view, their silhouettes unmistakable. Thunderhawk gunships, the harbingers of the Emperor's fury. The Adeptus Astartes had come. Space Marines descended into righteous fury, their ceramite boots shaking the battlefield as bolters thundered against the orc tide. The orcs reeled in shock, unused to the sight of warriors who could meet them in raw savagery and surpass them in discipline and might. The defenders of Hive Acheron, emboldened by this miracle, poured from their barricades to join the fight. For the first time since the war had began, the orcs knew defeat. The Space Marines wasted no time in securing the hive. A command post was established, and across the battered city, banners of the Adeptus Astartes flew once more. But their arrival was not welcomed by all. From the safety of his bunker, Overlord von Straub, ever the coward, railed against their interference. He insisted he had everything under control, but his protests fell on deaf ears. The force commander of the Blood Angels chapter, none other than Commander Dante himself, took immediate command of all remaining Imperial forces. With a voice like iron, he declared von Straub under arrest for negligence, assassination, and murder. Von Straub, unwilling to face judgment, attempted to flee. His land speeder was later found wrecked in the wastelands beyond the hive. His body never recovered. But while the tide of war had shifted in the south, the north still drowned under the weight of orc aggression. Warlord Ghazghkull had not relented in his siege of Hive Hades. His war machine grew stronger. His forces swelled with each passing day. The unyielding spirit of Hades, once a beacon of defiance, was beginning to falter. Food had run dry. Once, Hades had supplied the rest of the world, its factories and fields sustaining the defenders of Armageddon. Now the flow had reversed, and desperate shipments came south, struggling to keep the hive from starvation. Yet, no amount of aid could lift the shadow of despair settling over the city. The people of Hades felt the weight of impending doom pressing down upon them. A terror that even the indomitable Commissar Yarick could not drive from their hearts. The orcs were coming, and this time there would be no stopping them. Lord Commander Dante knew that if the Imperium had any chance of breaking the orc war machine, they had to strike at its head. He devised a daring gambit, an all-out assault to capture Ghazghkull Thraka himself. The Blood Angels would be deployed deep behind enemy lines, storming the Warlord's headquarters in a swift and brutal strike. If they could remove Ghazghkull from the battle, the greenskin horde would crumble. But fate had other plans. By sheer chance, Ghazghkull was not in his headquarters that day. He was at the front, overseeing his armies, reveling in the carnage. Though the Orc Warlord escaped the trap, the Blood Angels still left their mark. Their sudden strike tore through the Orc's spearhead, dealing a devastating blow to the Horde's momentum. Meanwhile, the battle for Hive Tartarus erupted into one of the bloodiest engagements of the war. The city became a charnel house as orcs and Imperial forces clashed in close quarters combat. The streets ran slick with blood as the two sides tore into each other with savage abandon. Time and again, the orcs attempted to break out, but each time they were forced back by the narrowest of margins. As the days of relentless slaughter dragged on, the orcs found themselves pushed to the brink. Their supplies dwindled to nothing. Their guns ran dry. Starving and desperate, they abandoned their crude firearms and fought like cornered beasts, wielding knives, rocks, anything they could find. But even their feral fury could not change the tide, and one by one, they fell. Some whispered that Ghazghkull had met his end that day, that a single bolter shell had struck the bionic half of his skull and felled him at last. But when the dust settled, no body was found. And though the Imperium celebrated, believing the Warlord slain, the truth would become clear soon enough. Ghazghkull Thraka had survived. But for now, the battle was won. With the fall of Hive Tartarus, the Second War for Armageddon came to its end. Leaderless and shattered, the Orc horde collapsed. Half their number lay dead on the scorched battlefields, and the survivors fled into the equatorial jungles, where, deprived of their war machines, they slowly devolved into primitive savagery. From that moment forward, the fate of Armageddon was sealed. The Imperium had held the line. The world remained in human hands. But deep in the darkness of the jungles, the embers of war still smoldered, waiting to ignite once again. As the war in the south reached its climax with the brutal battle for Hive Tartarus, The conflict on Armageddon Prime raged on, ignited anew by the arrival of Imperial reinforcements. With the warp storm finally dissipated, the Imperium's might surged into the war-torn system. Among the new arrivals was an unexpected but formidable force, an army of mercenary squats, battle-hardened warriors of the Leagues of Votan, led by Inquisitor Horst of the Ordo Xenos. Horst had won their loyalty in the crucible of battle on the mining world of Golgotha, where he fought alongside them against a mutual enemy. In gratitude for his aid, the squats had pledged their service, and now, upon arriving on Armageddon, they were swiftly directed to the embattled northern regions to bolster the Imperial defenses. But these warriors were not here merely to hold a line. As Hive Tartarus fell and the tide of war shifted in the Imperium's favor, Horst led his squat forces on a relentless counter-offensive. With grim determination, they surged forward, driving the shattered remains of the orc horde back toward the equatorial jungles. The squats unleashed the full power of their formidable war machines, mighty land fortresses, ancient behemoths of destruction, rolling across the battlefield like mobile citadels. Their massive cannons roared, sending fire and death into the fleeing greenskins. For the orcs there was no refuge, no chance to regroup. The Imperium had seized the momentum, and now, with the fury of the squats bearing down upon them, the greenskins had no choice but to retreat into the dense, unforgiving jungles where their mighty WAAAGH would wither and fade. At last, an Imperial relief force surged north toward Hive Hades, a mighty contingent drawn from the Blood Angels, Ultramarines, and Salamanders. 3 noble Space Marine chapters that had answered Armageddon's desperate call for aid once the warp storm had finally lifted. But their arrival came too late. By the time they reached the once proud Hive City, it had already fallen to the orcs. The defenders had fought to the bitter end, their lines crushed beneath the sheer, unrelenting tide of greenskin warriors. The streets of Hades were nothing more than a charnel house of shattered defenses and butchered Imperial soldiers. Few had survived. And yet, amidst the ruin, the Astartes found one man still standing. Commissar Sebastian Yarick, bloodied and broken, but unbowed, was discovered amidst the corpses of dozens of orcs, his battered chainsword still clutched in his hands. Though the Hive had fallen, he had endured, a living testament to the ferocity of the defenders and the price they had exacted from their enemies. Meanwhile, to the west, the war refused to die. A new wave of orc reinforcements crashed into the battlefield, surging toward Hive Tartarus in a desperate attempt to shatter the Imperial counteroffensive. The defenders in the western regions had already been stripped of their strength for the doomed battle at Hive Hades, and the greenskins cut through their weakened lines like a scythe through wheat. At their head was none other than Ghazghkull himself. The warlord had returned, undeterred by his supposed death, leading his warriors in one last ruthless attempt to seize Armageddon once and for all. The orcs smashed through the Imperial defenses at the Skeletus River, threatening to undo all that had been gained. For a moment, it seemed as if victory might yet slip from the Imperium's grasp. But the Emperor's angels of death would not allow it. With relentless fury, the combined might of the Space Marine chapter struck back, driving the orcs into a desperate retreat. The greenskins were pushed back to Armageddon Prime, their strength broken, their war machines burning in the desert sands. For 12 more Terran years, sporadic fighting raged on, but the orcs had lost their momentum. Their numbers dwindled, their war effort collapsed, and eventually they were forced to abandon the world they had fought so hard to claim. In 961 M41, the last of Ghazghkull's surviving warriors fled aboard newly constructed void ships, escaping the system at last. The Second War for Armageddon was over. The Imperium had prevailed. But for Ghazghkull, this was no defeat. The fire of war still burned in his heart. He had seen the measure of the Imperium's might, tested its steel, and found it worthy. He did not retreat in shame. He withdrew with purpose, his mind consumed by a single, unshakable desire: a rematch. And it would come exactly 57 standard years to the day after the war had begun.